and welcome to the Pink Ink Classroom. Come on in and let's get started. Today we're going to work on shading white surfaces. And I get asked in my classes about how do you add some color to white? It needs a little something extra, but you don't want to be too heavy-handed. So I have a few tips today on how to sort of bring those white areas to life. The first thing I want to talk about is the choice of colors that you're going to use for your shading. And I have 3 examples here, and each one is shaded with slightly different color tones. The skates here are shaded with grays, and I've actually used a metallic silver on the blades, but they're all tones of gray. The whipped cream on this sundae is shaded with tones of cream and taupe, and the snowman here is shaded in some tones of grayish blue. They have a little bit of a blue cast to them because when you look at snow in the light, it often has that little bit of a blue tinge. And that helps to add some depth to the color, but also reflect the object that you're coloring. So I'm going to start by shading the snowman. And before we begin, I want to talk a little bit about the light source because that's also key in shading white. So I did a little example here to show where the light source is coming from for the shading. And just for consistency, I have my light source coming from the upper left-hand corner for each of these objects. So as the light hits each of these balls of snow, it's going to make a little bit of a shadow on the opposing side. And then again, you want to also shade it anytime something connects to something else, like his arms go into his body, or when the muffler hits the snow here a little bit under these flags, just to kind of give them a little definition. So this is the finished example, and now I'm going to color one for you. So in this one, I've colored all the extra pieces, but I haven't done any of the whites. So as usual, I start with the lightest tone, and I'm going to think about the light coming in here and start adding a little color in the opposing areas. So catching under those flags, maybe a little bit along the top of that string. So I'm using it a little bit as an outline, and then also starting to lay in the shadow areas under his thumbs, across the top of the muffler, this side of his face, and under the brim of his hat. Now the big ball, you want to catch again under the flags, the muffler. But the primary shading is going to be done on this opposing side here. And I am using a cloud blue here, which is a very soft bluish gray color. That's my undertone. Now I'm going to switch to a little bit darker bluish gray and start laying in a little more shading here. I like to shade, when I get into these darker colors, maybe shade the darkest area first and then push it into the lighter area. I think you have a little bit more control over it that way. So I go from dark along the edge here, pushing it into the lighter area. I'm going to throw a little bit of a shadow under each of these little coal lumps that form his buttons, and more shading at the bottom of this ball. That would be probably the heaviest shadowed area. I like to catch those little V's that are in his cowboy boots and then go up the side, just like that. Now the last thing I want to do is go in with this nice slate gray, and I'm just going to beef up any area that would be the darkest edge or a little pinch up along here, catching those little corners. It's just a touch, but it's enough to make this snowman look rounded and keep it from being flat, because he just looks a lot more lively when the snow has some three-dimensionality to it rather than just being three flat balls. And you can always go back with your blender too and just kind of soften out those edges if you need to. This is a soft treatment, so sometimes that is really helpful. Okay, so the next one I'm going to work on is the pair of skates. So here's the finished one. And again, I'm using my little indicator here to show where our shadows are coming from. And we're going to shade the shoes and these laces that are pulled up together to form a bow. What I want to follow here, in addition to thinking of the light shining on the shoes, is where the shoes would be slightly indented, and that's here at the arch and above the heel. So we're going to add some shading there. And then you want to make sure the tongue of the shoe looks like it's underneath the outer part of the shoe. So all of these are little things to think about. When you work on a bow like this, you want to definitely make it darker as it's pinched in toward the center knot. And if the lace is twisted like this, the inside of the loop would be a little bit darker. So all these things to think about. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next group of colors. So these are sort of a traditional soft gray. I'm going to start, here's my unfinished one, start by adding some shading with a 30% French gray. This is one of my favorite shading colors because it's very warm. It's gray, but it's not cold. So the most distinction I need to show here is that one shoe is in front of the other. So that's the first shading I'm going to lay down. So I'm looking at the edge of that shoe and just shading all along the back one. And I'm going to go ahead and add some shading to the inside of that tongue so the laces look like they come forward, and just an outline of shading along that seam to give it a little bit of pop. And now I'm going to move to the front skate now and add some shading right along the edge of the sole, because it would make a little shadow there, and it also delineates it a little bit. And then push my light color up into the arch of the shoe, just kind of rotating in a little circular motion here, softly. And then I'm going to do the same thing in this heel area here, because this would be the bulge of the heel, and then there would be a little indentation up here. A little bit of shading along the back. And again, I'm going to emphasize those seams a little bit. And shade the tongue of the shoe, leaving the laces white. When you have anything highlighted in white, I'm going to say this more than once, you want to leave the paper to be your highlight, because that's the best, clearest white you're going to get, rather than laying down white with a pencil. So just leave the paper to be your white. Now I'm taking the darker color and pushing it out into the undershading a little bit. And softly, we're kind of building up some dimensionality into the skate. And I'm going to re-emphasize the color on the back one again. And now, just like I did with the snowman, I'm going to use the darkest color, and this is a 50% warm gray, and sort of beef up the last bit, the darkest areas, to give it a little more distinction. This is subtle. You can always go back in with your eraser if you've gotten a little bit too dark. And as I mentioned, you can always use your blender if you need to smooth it out a little bit. And this is leather, so it's a pretty smooth surface. You don't want it to be too rough looking. And now I'm going to work on the laces. I'm going to color in those back areas first and the little pinches that go into the knot. You have to look at this one carefully because there's 4 laces going up to form this bow. And you want to make sure you're not coloring them green like the foliage. I also like to add some shading here in the flat areas as this little bit of lace sort of flattens out. It would be a little more shaded there. And just pay attention to which one's in front and which one's behind. And I think you don't even need to go into the darkest color for this, but maybe you go to your mid-tone a little bit. You just want to pick out which one's in front and which one's behind. So the laces make sense. And I just want to point out on this stamp, this is something you could do with other stamped images as well. The way this is designed, the foliage falls behind these white skates, and that helps to make the skates pop forward. And that's something you could add to a stamped image on your own, just putting some color behind a white object too to make it look like it's in front or has a little more pizzazz. Okay, the last one I'm going to work on, and this is a quickie. This is my Super Sunday stamp, and all we're going to do on this is we're going to color in the whipped cream on top and the doily underneath. And they're both treated a little bit differently. But again, the point I'm making is on this one, the light source is not as key on this, but I did this just to kind of show you where the shadows are going to fall. But the main thing is that for this one, you want to pick like a cream color assortment of colors, because you don't want your whipped cream to look steely gray. That wouldn't be very pretty. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to add some cream on the bottom of each swath of whipped cream here, and on each side end, kind of where these little grooves are already drawn. So along the bottom and on each side, just feather it in toward the center. But you can see I'm leaving the centerpiece on each one white. Now for the doily, I'm going to go back and choose a gray instead of this cream, because this is paper, so it wouldn't have the same creaminess to it. And I'm just doing a hint of an underline where that footed glass is sitting. So under, and maybe casting a little bit to the right if the light's coming this way. And I'm just doing an outline around those scallops just to set them off a little bit. It's a very thin surface, so it really wouldn't cast much of a shadow. So now I'm going to use ginger root, and I'm going to re-emphasize each of those little division lines across the bottom. And this, even though it's whipped cream, it does bulge out a little bit. It would create a little bit of a shadow underneath. And then I want to pull these drawn lines out on each side to make it look like it came out of a squirty can. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with a raw umber, and this is again just a touch, and kind of beef up that little bit of a shaded area very lightly, but enough to give it a little bit of a dividing line between those 3 areas. And you can see just by adding that little bit of color, it makes that whipped cream look more realistic. So just to kind of go over quickly each of these points, I'm going to get out my little examples here. Think about your light source. Choose your color tints depending on what you're shading. Always use the white paper as your highlight. And just touches of deep color. Don't go too dark, but you do need a little bit to just give it a little bit of oomph. And don't be afraid to use your blender pencil if you need to shade it out. And that's how you transform flat white into shaded white.